If you were a fan of Hegemony, we've got a treat for you. Hopefully, potentially, your first look at World Order, the next game from those same people. This is, I'm going to say right now, this is a first look. We're going to talk about a few things that we think kind of set this game apart. We're not going to go into great detail and give you a full preview of how the whole thing works. But it does some interesting things. It has a little light deck building. It is kind of an area control, area and influence game. But the light deck building, not to mention some multi-use other cards, kind of make it unique.
Yeah, and just like Hegemony, this game kind of tries to teach you a little bit. It almost is like a simulation-style game. Like sitting in a class, basically. You're learning as you're playing it.
This feels like your best day in social studies where the teacher said, we're going to play a game today. And it was actually a cool simulation of some sort of socioeconomic thing. This one is about global influence and sort of like, well, world order.
And it takes you all the way back to 2010. That is when this is
so
set.
Far back.
When the global economies were kind of competing over influence of the world. And this is kind of a game about not just area control. There is definitely area control. There is definitely area majority. There is some like deck building, like David mentioned. There is resource generation. All of that is controlled by action cards. So it's done in a really interesting way where you are just kind of playing cards on your turn. That's where that deck building comes into play, because at the end of every round, you're going to be able to commit some of your cards that you didn't play to spend their resources to buy new cards, almost like a Dune Imperium.
Yeah, it has that sort of that aspect of deck building. But Ryan said it was light. It is lighter deck building because you're going to have a starting deck that's basically your first round and your second round. However, when you do research and gain new cards, I don't think you're going to gain a ton in one research, maybe one or two, and you're going to put those on top of your deck. So you will see those immediately in the next round. But given the way this is, it's just 6 rounds. Based on shuffling, you may not see some of those cards again until the end. It may be a while, depending on how many more cards you add.
Yeah, and unlike a lot of deck builders, in most of those games, you start with the same deck that everybody around the table starts with. In this, it's actually quite different. In fact, the setup of the game is quite asymmetric in general. Not hegemony levels of asymmetry.
No.
But you're starting with your own set of 12 cards for your particular country. And your player board is different. You have some strengths and weaknesses. You can produce more of some things, less of some things. Some of your actions are better or worse than other players. You have some different countries that you begin allied with, some different trade agreements. So there is a lot of layers to this game as far as playing one while you're still following the same general flow of the game, the same rules. What you're doing and what you're good at is going to feel very different based on which country you're playing. Some of them even have additional rules that interact how they interact with the game or change how they interact with the game.
Yeah, each country has one of these player aids, and don't be intimidated because even though this has a lot going on, you could practically learn the game from this.
Yeah, freeze frame right now, pause.
Yes, boom. I do want to say, again, this is a much more accessible game than Hegemony. However, this has a lot of depth still. I would say this is more medium weight. I think Hegemony felt a little heavier for sure. But there's a few things interesting going on here. One of the things that we wanted to focus on were not so much the action cards you're using, because those are what you're going to be doing to take a various number of actions, all the types of things that you would expect in an area control game to manipulate things. But also your production, all the things that you'd expect from a World Order game. But the country cards that you're allied with are really interesting because they can come into play in a number of different ways. They are incredibly multi-use. And like Ryan said, you're going to start with 4 at the beginning of the game, but you can access more throughout the game through one of the actions where you're basically gaining or improving relationships with countries, and you can go out and get countries that you're not allied with, or in regions that you don't have an ally. And those cards are going to bring a number of different things.
Yeah, and these are used, most actions of the game are going to allow you to exhaust these country cards for one thing or another. Now that's the key point, because you're going to have some of these country cards and you're going to say, ooh, I really want to exhaust it for this. Oh, but also for this. Oh, but also for this. And you get to exhaust it for one thing. And they give you a variety of different effects if you do so. You can exhaust them to help influence other countries in that area. So each one is kind of color-coded to an area of the board. You can exhaust it to help you get more alliances with nearby countries of that same color. You can exhaust them sometimes to build military bases, which is going to spread your focus. You can exhaust them to invest in that country and then get some economy going. We're actually getting income every round. And you can use them for trade agreements to do importing and exporting. All of these different things from one card.
Yeah, this truly, I can't tell you enough how much that feels like a simulation, and a lot of systems in place that are all built around that one type of card that you can have above your board. And it's also tied with one of the other interesting aspects to the turn structure. At the beginning of each round, there's going to be the preparation phase. And the last part of the preparation phase is to choose your focus. Everyone starts at domestic focus. And this first preparation phase, it's skipped in the first round. Sure. It's kind of set up for everybody. But you can choose domestic, diplomatic, or military. And depending on when you do that, you can produce different things. You're going to produce your basic resources, but then given the focus, you can produce sort of the secondary resources, but you have to spend some of the primary resources to do so, not to mention this is going to ready some of those country cards. My domestic focus, obviously, if I'm focused domestically, I'm not going to be able to refresh some more of those country cards. However, if I have diplomatic focus, I'm refreshing 4 of those, not to mention a few other things in terms of changing what the rest of that round is going to feel like for you.
Yeah, this is a very interesting part of the game, and choosing your focus is really going to benefit you for that whole round, because not only is it producing, like David said, something specific, it's giving you some bonuses to specific actions. Each one of these 3 focuses helps, obviously, like military helps you put troops on the board, diplomacy helps you get more countries, domestic helps you produce and research, but choosing that and then timing it correctly so that you're set up to do some of those actions, that you have a hand of cards, and each card is kind of color-coded so you know what type of action it's going to give you. It's really key. But also, these 3 different focuses are different for every player. Now, they're not wildly different.
Slightly different, but slightly.
They do some of the same things, but some of the costs are different. Some of the number of country cards that you refresh are different. The cost of production is different. Your bonus action may be slightly different. So that's another part of the asymmetry that goes into these different factions.
Yeah, if you appreciated the asymmetry in Hegemony, you're going to see some of that same detail-oriented work in terms of what they put into this design. And I think in many cases, when you see asymmetry with minor little differences, it speaks to the granular detail that they went into, as opposed to giant sweeping differences between the countries.
Yeah, like I said, there are special rules and some rules that only apply to specific countries as well. But all of this is kind of wrapped up in this whole idea of area control, area influence. Get as many of these country cards as you can, score as many points as you can. Obviously, there's a lot more that's happening, beneath the surface that's tying all these mechanics together with these action cards. And, like a deck builder, you start off with basic ones, you can get better ones. The game is going to really arc up as you play, because you're going to have, by the end of it, hopefully, a ton of those country cards to manipulate.
Hopefully.
In all those different ways we talked about.
Not to mention a lot of presence where you want presence out here on the board. And the last thing, a couple interesting things about how the area control works. There's 2 types of influence. You can get permanent influence and temporary influence. Permanent influence is going to have an impact on whether or not that region is actually even scored.
That's true.
And the temporary influence isn't obviously as lasting as the permanent influence, but it's more valuable point-wise if it does score.
Yeah, I think there's 2 things that really play into my enjoyment of an area control game like this, because you can choose. Permanent influence can never be messed with. And I am so used to playing games where I come into some place
and then it's wiped.
And immediately get wiped. And that sucks for me. Some people like that. I don't love it. And then also your countries that you've allied with, nobody can take those. They can't come and re-influence those countries, and you think you're set up for a big turn and then somebody takes your countries away. That can't happen here.
Yeah, and even the military aspect. You have military units, but this isn't a game about attacking one another. There will be whittling down of military units, but it's presented in such a way that it's more about the pressure that military puts on regions as opposed to the actual conflicts that are taking place.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
It is really interesting because it kind of weaves it more into a less of a conflict game and more of a, 30,000 feet and an escalation sort of thing, which again, I think is a really appreciated aspect. And again, if you want to learn all about it, they've got this giant book. This isn't the rule book. This is that book. If you really want the social studies class, this goes through and does a lot, just like Hegemony, with teaching you about the things and the different dynamics at play.
I feel like I've learned a lot about geopolitics just from playing this game, to be totally honest with you.
But that is your first look at World Order from Hegemonic. If you have any questions about it at all, please make them in the comments below. We will dig into this a little bit more, so if there's not an answer that we have, we'll get one for you. Until next time, though, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then.